It is expected to eliminate a range of tariffs on imports within the next 20 years. And this morning we'll be looking at what it actually means for supply chains that traverse in and out through Asia. Does it signal a possible resurgence in the new age of cooperation and the use of multilateralism? And what are the opportunities for US companies operating in the region or have links to it? In addition to our presenter this morning, we are joined by two member companies, Intel and UPS, who have extensive operations in the region. Before we begin, just a little bit of housekeeping. We have you all on mute as you enter this session. If you would like to participate in the conversation, please leave your questions or comments in the conversation chat box, which is available on this platform. We will try and get to all your questions after the presentation and in the Q&A session. And without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our very esteemed presenter, who is extremely well versed in this topic, Debbie Elms, the founder and executive director of the Asia Trade Center based in Singapore. Debbie is the founder, and she's also the Vice Chair and Advisory Board for the Asia Business Trade Association, Co-Chair of the Trade Policy Committee of Global Trade Professionals Alliance, GTPA, and also Senior Fellow of the Singapore's Ministry of Trade and Industries Trade Academy. Previously, Dr. Elms has been the head of Temasek's Foundation Center of Trade Negotiations, TFCTN, and the Senior Fellow of the International Political Economy at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. She received a PhD in political science in the University of Washington, an MA in international relations, and from the University of Southern California, and has a bachelor's degree from Boston University, which is also my alma mater. So nice to see you, Debbie. She also produces a trade blog called the Talking Trade Blog. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to Debbie, and thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here with you. Let me go ahead and get the slideshow ready. There it goes. Okay, so I'm happy to be here this morning to talk about RCEP. There is a tremendous amount of interest in this, as you can see from the number of people who are on this call and the number of calls that I've had recently to talk about RCEP, which is frankly gratifying because for years I was the only one interested in this trade agreement. And so I'm delighted that all of that effort and hard work has actually paid off for me, certainly, but also for everyone else as we move ahead with this. So last month, we had 15 members across Asia that signed the RCEP agreement. So that's all 10 members of ASEAN, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. So all of Asia is about to be linked together by one trade deal. So it's not the European Union, and it's not, especially for American companies, it's not the second coming of the CPTPP, the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, but it has 20 chapters. It's 510 pages of legal text. The total document is more than 14,000 pages. Now, you can't tell the quality of an agreement by page counts, but you can tell that a thin agreement is not 510 pages in length. And so this is really quite a robust agreement and actually more ambitious, I think, than most people anticipated, which is partly why we have this flurry of interest in what RCEP delivers. It will come into force, unclear exactly when. My best guess is January 1st of 2022. So you have roughly a year to get yourselves organized to be able to use this agreement. In order for it to come into force, we need 6 out of 10 members of ASEAN and 3 out of the 5 dialogue partners, China, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand. 3 of them have to approve the document, and then it becomes active 60 days later. So which is why I think it will be towards the end of the year when they finally get the 9th one over the line, and then 60 days later, the agreement comes into force. I want to note up front and dispel a myth that has been running for the last 8 years of negotiations. RCEP has never been China's baby. It was always driven by ASEAN, and I've always said, if it was driven by China, we would have arrived a long time ago. This was driven by ASEAN, in part because of ASEAN's existing agreements, but also because of ASEAN's intention to be at the center and in the driver's seat. And so it's an ASEAN agreement. Now, of course, once it comes into force, and I'll discuss this a little bit more later, once it comes into force, much of the momentum will likely go north because China, Japan, Korea are, economic powerhouses. And so the momentum in the agreement, once it becomes active, is likely to shift from ASEAN to elsewhere. But that doesn't mean that ASEAN will have no say, and it doesn't mean that China will automatically write the rules of trade in Asia. It provides, and I'll come back to this as well at the end, it provides a platform now for trade and economic issues in the region. This was not its original intention. Let me be clear. When they started RCEP back in 2012, there was no idea that they would be creating a potential, I don't want to say rival to the WTO because that's too ambitious, but that they would be creating anything that really wrote rules. That was not the idea. But now that we're in 2020 and we've had such disruption in trade and so forth, it's becoming more urgent that we have some kind of platform for these conversations. So the agreement will be led by a secretariat, still to be determined where and when that will be located, with regular meetings, officials, et cetera, et cetera. And it will be open for accession 18 months after we have entry into force. Now, this is going to be a bit challenging to use, particularly for those of you in the trade and goods space. And the reason for that is that the agreement was built on 5 existing ASEAN +1 agreements, ASEAN China, ASEAN Japan, et cetera. And the idea was they could just bundle them together and they would create RCEP and it would be very fast and very simple. It turns out it took 8 years to get done. Why? Because what I was willing to do with, let's say, Australia, New Zealand, I am less comfortable with a China. And so that was a problem for ASEAN itself. But then the dialogue partners did not have agreements either. So we had challenges between the dialogue partners, between especially Japan, Korea, which had no agreement, and Japan, China, which had no agreement until RCEP. And then India, which was an original signatory, original member of the agreement all the way through to last November, also had no agreements in place. So those dialogue partner arrangements were complicated. The net result of all of that, and it shows up most importantly, I think, in the goods negotiations, is that we have 37 different tariff schedules. So 37 different tariff schedules in place with different timelines, et cetera. So it is a bit of a mess. And not as useful in some ways as you would like. Like, it's much easier for companies, certainly, to just have tariffs fall to 0, done. That's not what happens in RCEP. So some fall to 0, some drop, some never change. So it's a bit of a mess. But what there is in the agreement is one rule of origin. And so that one rule of origin is going to be extremely helpful for companies because you'll start manufacturing goods for Asia. And then once you manufacture it for Asia, you don't need to adjust what's included in those goods. You don't need to change the raw materials, the parts, the components. You manufacture in Asia for Asia. And you use one certificate of origin in order to move those goods around 15 markets. Instead of having to use 5 separate trade agreement documents, you can now just use one. And I think that is going to be very helpful for firms. So let me just give you a quick snapshot of what this looks like. We happen to be doing this for one of the companies that we're working with. So I just thought, what the heck, I'll give you all soybeans, just to give you some sense of what's in this agreement. So you can see on the left, the chart on the left shows you the variation in tariffs before we started. That's the base tariff rate here in the middle. Then the preferential trade tariff rates is what happens over them. And then the chart on the side, on the right, shows you the decrease in tariffs over time. So sometimes from high, sometimes low. This is the part of the negotiation. How long do I have to cut tariffs? How fast am I going to cut them? Am I going to do it in equal stages? Am I going to cut it once and then hold and then wait? So there's a lot of different variation in here, and not every, but many of the countries have specific schedules with each other. So that also is why we have 37 of these. The rules of origin at the bottom here, you see ROO is wholly obtained for soybeans. In other words, to move soybeans around in Asia, you have to grow soybeans in Asia to move them in Asia. Now I want to contrast that with soybean oil. So once you take the bean and you smash it into oil, what happens? Well, we have again, just like with soybeans themselves, we have a range of tariffs that currently exist. Most of those are being cut, but not all of them. When you see this U here, U means unbound. I made no commitments at all. Nothing is changing for Chinese soybean oil. Others cut. You can see the Vietnam schedule here. Shows you that in year 10, ASEAN, Australia, China, Korea, and New Zealand all receive 0 tariffs, but the Japanese, for reasons I can't explain, have to wait an extra year to get 0 tariffs from Vietnam. So there's variation in all of these different schedules. But what there is now, if you look at the bottom, is the rules of origin There's two new ways, and often this is the case in RCEP. We have double ways, multiple ways to qualify for rules of origin. So in this case, you can change in chapter classification. You can take the bean from wherever, from Iowa or from Brazil, squish it in RCEP, and it qualifies for RCEP distribution under RCEP rules, which is great. Or you can add the RVC 40. Many of you who work in ASEAN are familiar with RVC 40. That is regional value content of 40%. So as long as 40% of the value of the oil is manufactured here in RCEP, it qualifies for these preferential tariff rates or lower tariff rates in the region. So I think that's extremely helpful. And you can see that this allows, and I think this is important, especially for American companies on the phone, it will allow a certain percentage or certain types, depending on how this works out, of non-RCEP content to continue to be distributed around in the region. So it's not a hopeless story if you're not actually in RCEP. Let me talk now, and I'm trying to get through this kind of quickly, and then I'm more than happy to answer all the questions that you may have in the Q&A. It's not just about goods. So many people have said from the beginning that RCEP is a trade in goods agreement. Of course, it has trade in goods benefits, which I just mentioned, but it also has services and investment. And I think this is particularly important because in Asia, we have done a rather poor job of negotiating rules for services and for investment. So we have inconsistent rules. We have lots of challenges in delivering services, especially across borders, because we have licensing and qualification restrictions and so forth. RCEP, by definition, then gives you more of a foundation for moving goods and services and investment. Now, there's a complication in services, which I'm not going to get into in detail, except to note that the officials use two different approaches to scheduling their own commitments in services. So in some of them, half of the members chose one method and half of them chose another method, and they are completely opposite in the way that you read the schedules. So in one approach, if you see the thing that you want to do, like landscape architecture, you're very happy because it means they've actually agreed to allow landscape architects to deliver services. In the opposite approach, taken by half of them, if you don't see it, you're happy because it means there's no restrictions. So just getting your mind around this opposite approach, I think, is tricky. There is a commitment that they will all converge on the same set of scheduling in services in time, which is great. Because it's right now for companies trying to unravel this and explain it to companies is killing us. There's a lot in the chapter as well. Consistency, you can't use qualifications and licensing except where it needs to be in place and you have to justify that. No more trade restricted than necessary. Crucially, and I think this is very important, a lot of restrictions on what I would call performance requirements for services and investments. As an example, in many trade agreements, you will see language that says you're allowed to open 3 branches. You're allowed to have 1 clinic or hospital. You must have X number of local staff. You can only invest if you have this kind of joint venture arrangement. RCEP largely has prohibitions on all of that. So I think that is going to be transformative for many of us operating in and around the region. There is no dispute settlement mechanism, no ISDS involved in this agreement. There was a complication. New Zealand changed governments halfway through, and they declared that they could no longer sign ISDS. So what we have instead for investor protection is a long section on expropriation, what the government can and cannot do for seizing property, and then a commitment to negotiate a mechanism within the first 2 years of the deal and to be concluded with that within 3 years. So 5 years from entry into force, we will have investor protections included in here. The most exciting chapter should have been e-commerce. This is the area where I spent most of my time, frankly, so I'm very disappointed because we thought that Asia could be very advanced in this. You know, everybody is mobile enabled, everyone is online. We certainly see it under COVID, but it turns out that ASEAN itself was complicated and ended up creating a less than helpful e-commerce chapter. So that is very upsetting. And it will probably need to be revisited sooner rather than later. So why is it upsetting? Well, because there's 3 things that you really want in an e-commerce chapter on data and digital. And the 3 things are something about cross-border data flows, something about where does the data need to be hosted, and then something about not imposing customs duties, tariffs, on what are called electronic transmissions, but basically services, digital software downloads. You don't want to pay tariffs on software downloads, because what a nightmare that would be. All three of them in the agreement, but weak. And in particular for cross-border data flows and data localization, the agreement says you're not going to you allow data to flow, no rules, no restrictions on where you host the data, except for public purposes. Okay, fine. But then there's this footnote that's a killer, which says I get to decide when it's in my public purpose, and you don't get to argue with me. So, you know, if you want to have data flow, you'll have data flow. If you don't want to have data flow, it's not going to flow. So that's a bit of a problem in the region. What it does instead, the chapter, electronic signatures, submit the documents online whenever possible. I mean, it's not useless, but it's not what it could have been. So disappointing there. Now, one challenge that we always have in ASEAN and in ASEAN style agreements is they love flexibility. So flexibility, policy space, they love it. Businesses hate flexibility in policy space, because what you want as a company is you want to know what are the rules, and what are the rules of what I can do, what are the rules of what I can't do, and you don't want to see something that says members shall endeavor to. What does that do for you as a company? Members shall endeavor. Are they going to endeavor? Are they not going to endeavor? How hard are they going to endeavor? We have no idea. What you want is members shall do this. And actually, what is surprising, I think, in RCEP in the end was the extent to which we see members shall do such and such. That's fantastic. So the ability of members to have that flexibility has been limited. It's not to say, before I get all the governments upset, it's not to say that you've lost your policy space entirely, no. It's just that in areas where you felt comfortable with a more hard and binding commitment, you've made that. I think that's fantastic for governments to have limited a bit flexibility, because again, what's the point of a trade agreement? It's to lower the risks and increase the certainty around trade in the region. And if you have too much flexibility, you undermine the central point, in my view, of the trade agreement. So the agreement is legally binding, most of it, not all of it, but there is it's quite a robust, actually, dispute settlement chapter in here. So we don't have investor state dispute settlement for investors to sue the government when they expropriate and fail to compensate. But we do have state-to-state dispute settlement embedded in this agreement, and I suspect that actually they will use it because they want to see what that does. And with the WTO system currently stuck, you could show that RCEP and Asia could manage disputes with a secretariat that can manage it as well. So I think that's very promising. What happened to India? I get this question a lot. So we started with 16 members, and India participated from the very first round through 29 rounds of this thing until last November, when they sort of famously announced that they would not be proceeding to the signature stage. So why not? Well, there's a couple of reasons. They gave lots of different reasons over the years. Not enough tariff concessions, too much tariff concessions, too much pressure on India's tariffs, difficulties around this accumulation in rules of origin, problems with not enough services access, insufficient movement of people. But the bottom line really is that, as you can see from the photo here of the protest, there was no constituency really in India that wanted RCEP. So since no one wanted it, you ended up with not having it. And I think that's a bit of an issue. Now, India negotiated all of its schedules and so forth, and so it can join at any time. In fact, there's the only time I think the word India appears in 510 pages is a little footnote that says if India wants to join before the accession window opens in 18 months, it's free to do so. So India could come back, but I think, frankly, under Modi, it's not going to happen. What happens to RCEP, non-RCEP members? Like all trade agreements, RCEP doesn't care where you're headquartered. It doesn't care where you pay taxes. What it cares about is where are you, what are you doing and where are you doing it? As long as you're in Asia for Asia, much better. So many of the firms on this call are already in Asia. They can participate in RCEP for the most part. And I think that's very important because we're going to have, I think, the beginning of in Asia for Asia trade, which we have not had because it's been very complicated to move goods and services around in the region. So it will make it easier. And I think there will also be companies, even if they don't use the FTA themselves, but the mindset comes, right? The mindset says, oh, I should think about RCEP. I should think about new markets in RCEP. And so I suspect that we will have firms using RCEP, whether they formally use it or they don't, but this idea of creating things in Asia for Asia is going to take off. As I mentioned in the rules of origin, some of them allow up to 60% of the content to be from outside of Asia. So there will still be ways for non-members to participate in the supply chains in the region. And of course, the consistent rule book helps non-members everywhere. Once I facilitate trade at customs, it helps a lot of people. Once I have better intellectual property rights rules, which I didn't talk about, which are quite impressive, I think, in RCEP, that benefits goes to everyone. It doesn't sort of say, well, trademarks only cover RCEP countries and not you. So, you don't get that. That's not how that works. It was not an easy agreement. So we had 29 rounds. I think we may have had more, but I think we all stopped counting at 29. 11 ministerial negotiations. There were at least 4 times that the leaders met to negotiate, not just met to sort of have a photo op. It was difficult. And it was difficult because over the course of the negotiation, we had members who couldn't even sit together outside of RCEP. So the Koreans and the Japanese, you may recall, were unable to literally be in the same room together outside of RCEP, but in RCEP they sat Korea, Japan, alphabetical. And so they got an agreement done. I think that's a miracle. And then once it starts, we will have this sort of platform in place to start addressing trade, which we didn't have before. And areas that I can imagine being ripe for RCEP discussion are things, new areas, 3D printing, which we've been talking about for a while, but we don't have rules. So who owns the IP for 3D printing? And what are we going to do about the raw materials for this? What are we going to do when we start 3D printing food? What are we going to do when we 3D print pharmaceutical products? So some of those rules, I imagine, could be set in RCEP. Again, it was not the original intention, but as we get closer to the conclusion of this, that seems to be where they're headed. Let me mention, because I happen to be on a US audience here, about the CPTPP connection. So we had 7 members who were part of this TPP/CPTPP who were involved in the room. For the most part, during all the years when we had overlapping negotiations, you never saw or heard the word TPP mentioned in RCEP. And it didn't appear, sort of as TPP started and then stopped and then resumed again, it didn't appear to have a whole lot of impact on the negotiations themselves. But if you look at the text of the 2 agreements, you will see that there is clear overlap. Particularly the IP chapter is very, very similar. The rules of origin look very similar in terms of the structure. Product-specific rules of origin is in TPP. It's not a traditional ASEAN approach, so this is new. The services and investment listings and schedulings looks very, very much like CPTPP. Now, why? Because we had 7 members, and they were the ones who pushed, most of them. And because they wanted to make sure that they had consistency, because you can't be in 2 different agreements that go in different directions. And because some of the RCEP members knew that they would probably join CPTPP at some point. And so they also had an incentive to make sure that we were in alignment. Overall, CPTPP, much broader, much deeper than RCEP, but that's much better than ASEAN. So, there's consistency between them. There's still some gap between where CPTPP is and where RCEP is. So Malaysian government, get in CPTPP, please, would be good for you. Finally, my last slide is just to note that as we head into 2021 and beyond, of course, trade badly disrupted. And the mechanisms that we have traditionally relied on for managing trade have suffered. They've suffered for a whole lot of reasons. We don't need to get into that right now, but I'm happy to do it in the Q&A if you want. But I just want to note that because that's been such a challenge, we have had all of these other trade institutional mechanisms coming up in the region, like these digital economy agreements that Singapore particularly likes to sign, CPTPP itself expanding hopefully 2021 and beyond, RCEP as RCEP comes into place, lots of bilateral agreements. Singapore has just announced 3 agreements in the less than a month, RCEP with the UK and with the Pacific Alliance. So, those kinds of expansion and trade, I think, is going to continue. But they all have different members, different rules, different provisions. And so the complexity is really a bit overwhelming sometimes for firms. And that's going to continue to be a challenge for companies in terms of figuring out how do we design trade rules that work for companies and that work for governments as we go forward. Because the more you have rules, the harder it is to design a new one that doesn't conflict in some way with existing ones. And the last sentence that I'm just going to say is that in this sort of disrupted environment, with new opportunities and also still strong headwinds, firms have to look harder for competitive advantage. So we recommend, it's perhaps not a surprise, Trade Center, we recommend that firms start by looking at these latest generation of FTAs, which have significant bottom line benefits for companies. I can't promise it across the board with RCEP, but in general, we should be able to find you new markets or save you money or both. RCEP a little less of a promise. I can do that for sure on CPTPP, but on RCEP a little less. But the point is, if you're not looking at it, you're missing an opportunity. So let me stop there, and I'm delighted to take questions and participate in the conversation with my colleagues. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Debbie. I'd like now to introduce John Goyer. He is the Senior Director of Southeast Asia for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in Washington, D.C. He concentrates on the developing and implementing the Chamber's ASEAN regional projects, as well as bilateral programs with individual countries in the region. In addition, he's also responsible for the Chamber's Australia Working Group and the Chamber's Myanmar outreach. Before joining the Chamber, John served as Vice President for the Coalition of Service Industries, a US-based membership association promoting the liberalization of international trade and investment services. And he has worked with coalition member companies with the US and with the US trade negotiators to ensure that the US service industry international trade objectives were reflected in bilateral, regional, and multilateral trade agreements. Without any further ado, John, I'm going to hand it over to you to take us into the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Siobhan, and I want to thank AMCHAM Malaysia and the team for organizing this event, and very glad to see that we have the AMCHAMs of the Asia Pacific participating, as well as folks from Washington. Siobhan, you've handed it to me. I'm basically going to hand it over to our panelists, and by way of very brief introductions, we will hear from two trade policy specialists who have a great deal of experience on trade matters. Our first speaker will be Ms. ShuiMei Lin, UPS's Vice President for Public Affairs, responsible for policy advocacy, issues management, public sector collaboration, and sustainability in the Asia Pacific region. She's a trade policy and public policy practitioner with more than 2 decades of experience and leads a team of 12 government affairs professionals who together form UPS's Asia Center of Excellence for Public Affairs. She chairs the Customs and Trade Facilitation Committee of USABC and also serves on the boards of Green Freight Asia and the Conference of Asia Pacific Express Carriers. Prior to joining UPS in 2010, she worked at the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Singapore and was a member of the APEC policy team during Singapore's chairmanship of that grouping. She spent more than a decade working on US-Vietnam relations, coordinating efforts to gain support for economic normalization between Hanoi and Washington, while facilitating government-to-government understanding and assisting US companies on the ground. She lived in Hanoi in the late 90s and designed technical assistance programs for Vietnamese ministries and advised on issues relating to the US-Vietnam bilateral trade agreement and Vietnam's WTO accession. We will then hear from Mario Palacios, the Senior Managing Director for International Trade Policy at Intel. He's responsible for Intel's policy and advocacy related to legislative, regulatory, and administrative developments in all international trade policy areas, from digital trade to export controls, customs, trade facilitation, and supply chain assurance. In this role, Mario leads a global team overseeing worldwide advocacy efforts focused on reducing policy and regulatory barriers that impact the company's supply chain. He has been with Intel for almost 15 years now, prior to which he worked with TradeBeam, a trade software company in the San Francisco area. And he's also worked as a project analyst with the UN, served as an economic analyst with the Eurasia Group, and as a foreign trade and immigration specialist with McGrath-Sheldrick in London. I will ask them each to offer a few minutes of remarks, and I think to the extent that you both can, I'd like you to maybe react to some of the things that Debbie put forward. After their comments, we'll open it up to Q&A and discussion. I see that a lot of questions are already piling up in the chat, so this should be a good discussion indeed. With that, ShuiMei, let me turn the virtual floor to you.
Great. Good morning and good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, John and Siobhan, for inviting me to join this panel. You know, it's always very difficult to follow on with Debbie, particularly on the topic of RCEP. So, but I'm grateful that she did that great introduction for us as well. As John mentioned, I work for UPS, and in particular, I work for the UPS Asia Pacific region. So maybe let me share with you a little bit of what this means for us here as an Asia Pacific business unit, right? So first of all, I think we're very excited about it. RCEP is my free trade agreement, I will say, at least working for UPS in Asia Pacific region. My remit is exactly those 15 countries, right? Anywhere from North Asia, China, ASEAN, down to Australia and New Zealand. So this is sort of the agreement that brings my entire business unit and all the countries that we have in the Asia Pacific business together. And I think as Debbie alluded to earlier on, it really is the Asia for Asia free trade agreement. In APAC, we also say the same thing. In UPS APAC, we also say the same thing. The future of Asia is really Asia, and this has been true since the financial crisis. A lot of our countries here have recognition that we're all quite like-minded. In addition, we want to be less reliant on some of the G3 countries or the US and EU, where high growth has not always been super high. So I think this is really, really a great agreement for us here in Asia. And of course, as a multinational, we also welcome the integration because this is an agreement that brings all these markets together, creates a common rule book, and so that allows us to create scale. As a multinational, that's really important for us. So it's tremendously meaningful. One piece, I think, one important thing to recognize is that it's actually tremendously powerful. Despite whether or not you think the agreement is high standard, low standard, it is so powerful because why? It is a trade instrument that is laid on top of all these different visions that we have in Asia, and several of them. ASEAN, APEC, Free Trade Agreement of the Asia Pacific, the Belt and Road, the more recent dual circulation vision that China has, even decoupling. All that, RCEP is this trade instrument that's laid on top of all these different platforms and trends and visions. And so it's tremendously powerful because it's not only trade, it's not only economics, it's also politics, and it's also cooperation that will all come together because as a result of all these reinforcing visions. And that's obviously really powerful and very strategic for our region, and will create a whole lot of synergies, more than just the trade, right? It will create the interoperability, the cooperation between firms, all that will come, the MRAs, the common standards, all that I think will then be developed as a result of all these different, all these movements, and then of course with RCEP. A couple of observations on supply chain since that question was asked. First, I think, as with all trade agreements, people come with their supply chain maps and say to governments, do this for me. This is my supply chain. Can you help me? So a successful free trade agreement and successful RCEP in this case will strengthen supply chains and will strengthen current supply chains, regardless of whether there are tariff reductions or not. We know that they will strengthen supply chains because why? There's customs and there's additional transparency and the services that support it, etc. So it will strengthen current supply chains. I think just to point out one particular supply chain that we sort of see, there's quite a bit of benefits that could potentially come out from it is, Vietnam, for instance. So Vietnam going into the RCEP negotiations knows that it makes a third of the world's galaxies in Hanoi, and it knows it imports a lot of components in order to support that manufacturing, and then it knows that it exports a lot of phones, whole products out of Vietnam to the rest of Asia. And so when you look at, as you look at the tariff schedules of the RCEP, you start to see that, yes, some of these components coming into Vietnam, a lot of them from Korea, a lot of them from China, tariff-free. There's a tariff opportunity there. And then as they export whole products, finished products, phones, to China or to Korea or to others, that tariff has also dropped. So you'll see that a lot of times these free trade agreements are built around companies and firms that know what they want, and have helped shape negotiations. And certainly in the case of Vietnam with the Samsung Galaxies, that's certainly been the case. So strengthens current supply chains. That's really great. The second observation that I will make is, I think as Debbie mentioned with regard to e-commerce, I do agree that it's a little bit disappointing, but more on the good side, it is disappointing because, the RCEP agreement was negotiated 8 years ago. The customs chapter in particular was closed first. And so I think that it was a missed opportunity because it didn't really capture some of the new business models and trade flows that have developed as a result of e-commerce, the e-commerce explosion here in the region in the last 3-4 years. I think that's a little bit of a missed opportunity. In addition to that, I think e-commerce has really, and by e-commerce I mean trading goods e-commerce, has really gone through the roof as a result of the last year of COVID. I think that is a really important dynamic that needs to be captured. I hope that moving forward, at least there will be more discussions about this. I understand RCEP is interested in coming together to talk about this further, in particular the e-commerce chapter. So I think that would be an important opportunity for all of us to keep an eye out on. I'm going to stop here and turn it over to Mario, because Mario, I think, represents a very important supply chain, tech supply chain. And so I think important for us to hear from him. Mario, back to you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Mario.
Oh, thanks, John, and thank you, ShuiMei, and also like to thank the AMCHAM in Malaysia and also the U.S. Chamber of Commerce for the opportunity, and to be here with you all virtually from my home in suburban Maryland, where we're expecting a snowstorm. So we'll see how that goes. I think Debbie really did a fine job of really hitting some of these very key areas of the agreement, and I do want to just kind of emphasize on just how monumental the agreement is. It's the largest trade agreement, right, that we've seen, and the timing associated with the agreement is just kind of very interesting, because what's occurring now is we have this RCEP agreement that's now shifted everyone's attention to Asia, and it will put pressure on the incoming Biden administration to do something, right? And I also really liked Debbie's comment about ASEAN driving the agreement, and it's not China's baby. There is a misconception, and I think that's something that I think that the companies that are operating in the ASEAN region, in the countries of ASEAN, like Malaysia, like Vietnam, for us, for example, it's upon us to help keep driving that message. And certainly it does provide and sets the stage for a lot of monumental activity as well, that moving beyond what was agreed. From a semiconductor industry perspective, we think this is a milestone, and it certainly can become the anchor for a lot more liberalization to come afterwards. And we also leverage companies like ShuiMei's express carriers to move our goods as well. We're not just a traditional company that moves things via air freight or over land or by sea, but we use all conveyance. So the ability for this agreement to move forward and expand much of what was already agreed to in the trade facilitation agreement by the WTO, thinking about MRAs that can help move goods from customs to their end port, but also just around the region, I think it's very important. Elements that go beyond the simplification of customs procedures, but also harmonizing them. Thinking about how we can look at leveraging those wins and rules of origin to ensure that customs valuation and the timeline for the issuance of advanced rulings is also completed as well. These are all things that, when you take in aggregate, will help it reduce the throughput time and reduce cost. I think that's a huge area that I think this agreement will help, and certainly help companies trade in goods, certainly many of the countries already involved in RCEP are members of the WTO ITA for ICT goods, and certainly part of the ITA 2, the expansion of the ITA. But certainly there's more, right? There could be more, and certainly I think as the attention of the world now moves back to multilateral trade, there could be an opportunity for RCEP to be a vehicle for an additional information technology agreement. Some folks are saying ITA 3 that could take into consideration some of what Debbie mentioned and ShuiMei mentioned as trade in items of the future that weren't even around 8 years ago, and certainly not around when the first ITA was negotiated, like 3D printing and the items around that. Also, rules of origin. I think the rules of origin is something that is for some of us who follow customs procedures or our customs brokers in our respective areas. Those matter, right? Rules of origins matter, and having such a large block of countries beginning now to have a uniform idea of how to identify rules of origin and certainly have more flexibility to claim preferential origin, I think is fundamentally huge. And lastly, I mean, we talked about it, but I do think we shouldn't always look at it as something that is bad, but because I think ShuiMei did a really good job of just really contextualizing that 8 years ago when this kicked off, who was really thinking about e-commerce, who was really thinking about customs duties on electronic transmissions. Electronic transmissions, as we've seen because of the pandemic, have just skyrocketed, and in the trade and e-commerce, purchases made online and how goods are shipped around the world, certainly intra-regionally, has also taken off. So I think it is an opportunity, and it does again it could be an opportunity for RCEP countries to lead in this discussion with respect to e-commerce, with respect to data flows and data localization, hopefully being forward-leaning with respect to those areas. There is a joint statement initiative going on right now at the WTO in Geneva, thinking about the moratorium on electronic transmissions. It could be something that RCEP countries can lead on and to advance that dialogue a bit further. But certainly, I think the opportunity for intra-Asian trade, trade for Asia, I think is certainly a huge milestone. And frankly, after having 4 years of trade being such a bad thing for many of us, or something that we've had to play defense around to protect supply chain transparency and predictability, I think this agreement being signed and the work that's going to be done to ratify this agreement around the region this next year is an opportunity to put trade back on the map as a policy item for good, as a policy item to help boost economies as we emerge post COVID-19. I think that's something that I think we have to look forward to, and certainly this agreement's going to help do that.
Thanks very much, Mario. Appreciate that. So we've got a few questions lined up, and I'm just going to try to take them more or less in order. The first one from IBM is concerning technical barriers to trade and how RCEP compares with the WTO agreement on TBTs. I guess that's directed at Deborah.
That's a great question. So, one of the things that we have heard, I have certainly heard, is concerns about Asia's setting standards in RCEP, and what would be called the TBT chapter, but is actually called ASEAN has its own nomenclature, so it's not actually called TBT. But that chapter plus the SPS, the sanitary and phytosanitary chapter for food and food safety, the two chapters are there, but they basically replicate existing WTO commitments, and they don't go very much further than that at the moment. And the reason they don't is because the members themselves are very diverse. Remember, think about RCEP. It has 15 economies, from tiny little Laos to massive China, from very poor Myanmar through very wealthy Singapore. So trying to get an agreement that works across these 15, difficult. And in standards, I think it's relatively thin. But this is where I'd like to sort of make a pitch for AMCHAMs in particular. As we move towards implementation and as we have the agreement come into force, there is a real opportunity, I think, for companies to help structure how this develops over time. And in particular, I would highlight the way that ASEAN works, because remember, this agreement, RCEP, was modeled on ASEAN. So in ASEAN, we have ongoing working committees on various kinds of things. And when we have had businesses who have gotten involved in those committees and have followed and have tracked and have participated, we've gotten new rules. And the one that I would point to in particular is cosmetics. So in ASEAN, the cosmetics industry has done an unreal job, to be honest. I don't know who was responsible for this, but they're a genius, of figuring out how to get ASEAN across. I think now they've had 57 sessions of the Cosmetics Committee. They meet like 3 times a year, and each time they meet, they do something like, okay, so bottle of lotion, what is an ingredient that can be added or shouldn't be added? So they keep expanding out the ASEAN rules on cosmetics. The same thing could happen on standards in RCEP if companies like, and driven by groups like AMCHAM, can help support governments in what kinds of standards are the issue. What are the actual bottlenecks that you face? And then how can we work with the RCEP economies to get that outcome? So I think there's a real opportunity here for business associations and companies to participate in the rollout, the implementation, and then ultimately the rule setting in especially standards.
And Deb, are any of those structures either on the drawing board right now or in place or in some process of implementation? If a company wants to participate in some of those working groups, what do they do?
Well, right now, it's always been a bit of a challenge on RCEP to figure out how companies should connect. But the agreement itself has a series of committees. And then these committees headed by the Joint Committee, which is the lead agency. Joint Committee's task number 1 is to make a secretariat. So once they make a secretariat, and there was a question about where it will be, unclear, please Singapore, grab the secretariat. Once they make a secretariat, then I assume we'll have an organized body who will be structuring many of these committee sessions, and many of these committee sessions from the text includes commitments to have regular sessions with stakeholders. So again, the more that business pushes to be involved, the more you're going to get involved, because there's a lot of openings in RCEP, but only if we seize them. So we really need to make sure that we are pushing business outcomes into RCEP in order to ensure that they get there. So I go back to my cosmetics example. Why has the cosmetics industry been so successful in ASEAN? Because someone had the bright idea to show up, and then they just kept showing up, and they actually get what they want. And so that's how you have to do things in this part of the world. You have to just push, show up, find a loophole to get in, and then you can start shaping things, I think. And that's to me also a key benefit of RCEP overall, is that we now have this framework that will allow us to engage and to push certain kinds of policies that make more sense, and to try as much as possible to say, actually, this other idea, not so helpful, and here's why.
Okay, thanks for that, Deborah. There were a couple of questions here related to IP. One, I think the gist of the question is how RCEP's IP provisions will protect goods from, being counterfeited, faked, that sort of IP infringement. And then the second relates to the pharmaceutical industry and how RCEP may affect pharmaceutical supply chains.
Okay, I was hoping that ShuiMei would jump up and say, I've got the pharmaceutical supply chains covered, but if not, let me just talk briefly about the IP chapter, which, to be honest, I haven't looked at in the depth that I should. But I think what's useful about the IP chapter in general is that, again, it goes in areas that we have never seen in this part of the world. If you think about the existing ASEAN +1 agreements, only one of them had a chapter on IP with Australia, New Zealand, and it was 10 years old now, and it was very thin at the time. So the fact that these 15 countries were able to come together and design what I think is a very ambitious IP chapter, on copyrights, on trademarks, on all kinds of things, very useful, and goes in directions that RCEP doesn't normally go. Now, the enforcement of IP, there's 2 parts to IP, of course. You have to protect the ideas, but you also have to enforce that protection. Enforcement has always been a bit of a weak spot in this region. So whether they really push hard on enforcement, I think will, again, for me, depend on whether companies push. But there's now another avenue that you can use to say to a government, hey, look, you promised to do this. You don't seem to be doing it. How can we help you achieve this objective that you have here in RCEP? If we don't have the RCEP and we don't have the document, we don't have the commitment by the leader down to do something, it's very hard as a company to push and say, hey, actually, look, these infringing materials are getting through, or, you know, this is a particular challenge we're facing here. The government doesn't have an incentive to act if you can't say, hey, it runs counter to your commitment here in RCEP. So I think lots of rules on IP, enforcement, always a bit of a weak spot in Asia. And so I think that, again, more corporate help would assist with that enforcement part.
ShuiMei, did you want to hit the supply chain aspect of the question?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that.
And also, Mario, maybe I'll put you on deck. I'd be interested in your thoughts on IP, particularly as they would relate to, I suppose, trade secrets or other aspects of the IP regime in the electronics industry. ShuiMei.
Yeah, just a little bit about the healthcare supply chain. I mean, we do quite a bit of transportation of healthcare products. I do think that the RCEP does try to, in particular in the COVID era, does try to address some of the things that we will need moving forward. And, you know, starting with PPE and all the way to the vaccines, there are, you know, quite a few of tariff reductions. And as you all know, in the region, whether APEC or ASEAN, we've all committed to reducing trade barriers for essential goods. And some of us have agreed to remove trade barriers for essential services. But the essential goods stuff, the pharmaceuticals, the medicines, the vaccines, the PPE, that, as I understand it to be in the RCEP, has been addressed. And I think for the most part, quite a few markets have reduced their tariffs on these products. So great for us, you know, I think going into this next era of vaccine deliveries. On the customs side, I think there are quite a few provisions that are meaningful. They are not WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement Plus, but they are meaningful, for us going into this delivery of vaccines era. Perishables, there's a pretty good WTO TFA provision on perishables, you know, ability to move the perishables to a storage location before customs and be customs cleared at that location. That's important. Temporary movement of containers and pallets, that was actually in a provision that the Australians tabled at CPTPP or at TPP. And that was a provision that was really important because a lot of the vaccines and pharmaceuticals come in containers that you know, move in and out of the country, but you don't want the containers themselves to be taxed or have duties. And these containers are important because they, you know, they keep the temperature trueness of pharmaceuticals or vaccines. So that was really cool, I think, that, you know, RCEP was able to capture. And then the last thing I'll just say is, this is the disappointing side, is obviously India is not in there. India is such a big part of the pharmaceutical and vaccines, biologics supply chain in the world. And if we had captured India, if India was in RCEP, I think it would be so much more meaningful going into, you know, sort of in the next couple of years, where a lot of it's going to be coming out of Pune. A lot of the vaccines going to be coming out of Pune, coming to Asia. So that's the piece I think was disappointing. Let me turn over to Mario.
Like Debbie, I haven't delved too deep in the IP chapter of RCEP, but at a very high level, I think some of the issues that I think we need to see kind of play out through ratification and implementation is capacity. Not all members of the agreement have the same capacity with respect to IP protection, IP laws, standards, and certainly enforcement. And I think that's something that we need to get more clarity with respect to how capacity building is going to occur. How can some members of the agreement seek assistance from other more advanced economies with respect to these topics? So I think that's a big item. But I do think thinking about leveling the playing field with respect to IP protection laws, implementation, and certainly enforcement, I think will be something to watch, particularly when we think about the semiconductor semiconductor manufacturing, in the ecosystem across Asia on semiconductor manufacturing, not just the end result of the item coming out of a factory, but the design, development, and also sometimes there are a lot of foundries in the area too that receive technology from semiconductor designers, and they fab the items for them, right? So I think that's where some of this, if the supply chain is going to build out and certainly be more expansive, that's an area I think that the agreement and those parties signatory which have agreed to these chapters have to really provide more clarity on.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mario. Question on why, I guess this is a Debbie question again, why labor and environment were excluded from RCEP given the prominence of those issues internationally. And also, did RCEP do anything for movement of labor?
Some great questions. So let me start with the last one first. So there is a movement of natural persons chapter, but if you look at the commitments, it is, to me, a bit surprisingly thin, which is, normally in that chapter, it's things like intercorporate transferees. It includes, temporary movement to see trade shows. It includes, sometimes it includes spouses. It includes, there's a lot of things that you can put into those chapters. But if you look at RCEPs, it's really, really, really thin because they were very concerned about movement of people in most of the markets. So the commitments in the agreement on movement of people for temporary provision of services, mostly just intercorporate transferees, and even then limited. And of course, you always have to follow immigration and so forth, visas. So I don't think there's gonna be a lot of people moving. When it comes to a labor chapter or an environmental chapter, this is key questions. Last week was my Europe on RCEP week, and I ended up doing a ton of, DG Trade. European Parliament had a special session on RCEP. And of course, the questions that came in especially were around labor and environment. Why isn't it in RCEP? The answer, I think in short, is that these are not countries that wanted to do that. They did not want to have labor and environmental rules embedded in this agreement, and so they don't. It's not to say that as a rule, we necessarily want to, harm labor or want to ruin the environment. That's not the point. The point is that they were not eager to have binding rules in particular on these two areas, and so they're not included. Now, what does that mean for the future of these kinds of negotiations? I think it's tricky. And so I think one of the reasons why the Europeans were particularly incensed was they said, wait a minute, we're trying to negotiate all of these agreements in the region that include comprehensive sustainability and environment and labor, worker rights kinds of things in our agreements. Is that agenda dead in Asia? And I don't think that's the case, but I think among the Asian markets, they said this is not for us. It's hard enough to get the deal done. Let's not make it more complicated.
Okay, well, thank you. I guess sometimes the simplest explanation is the best one. Siobhan, how are we on time? Can we take a couple more questions?
I think we could probably take just maybe one more. We're just hitting the time right now, the 9:31.
Okay, well, a question here from Leslie Griffin, who, as an aside, is a UPS alumna and also an alumna of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. So I'm glad that Leslie could join. The question is the investment chapter in RCEP. The spotlight's been on the elimination of performance requirements, expropriation rules, but were there any notable examples of sectors that were previously closed that were opened as a result of RCEP? And the question is particularly in the context of Indonesia's opening up of its negative investment list, but more broadly, did things jump out at you that were opened up that hadn't been prior to RCEP?
I think that's a great question. I think it's difficult to say at the moment because we have investment was all negative list scheduling. So the assumption is everything is opened unless I tell you that it's not opened. And if I tell you it's not opened, then I told you that in two different ways as well. So we have 15 schedules, but then 15 times 2. So it's really 30 schedules. The first batch of list A is areas where there are restrictions on delivery of investment and potentially services, but especially investment, that may adjust in the future. And in there, we see some adjustments already from what we have for investment regimes in the region. So we already see some things coming off lists. We already see flexibility by list A, which is I have already committed to potentially making changes in these areas in the future. But there's also list B, and list B is areas where I'm not going to make any adjustments in the future. List B for some of the members are rather broad and sweeping restrictions. And so then you're like trying to figure out what does that mean for me or my company or my investment abilities. If it has something that says, except when national security is involved, is that helpful? Is that not helpful? I don't know. So I think my challenge in terms of assessing the benefit is I don't know how broad these list B exemptions will be. They could be extremely broad in some cases, and they could be very narrow in others. So it's a little hard to say based on the commitment in the document what the ultimate impact will be on investment. But I think the point that the fact that we have rules is amazing. Consistent rules on investment is amazing. The idea that we're going to have an investment mechanism that covers 15 markets, fantastic. And then that we have commitments that you can now hold countries to is useful, because the original list, you can imagine, was like, 800 pages long. These are all the things I'm not going to allow. And then they had to be whittled back, and it's down to a much more manageable level. So all of that I think is good, with the notable exception that it depends in part on how you implement, particularly those list B restrictions.
Thank you for that, Debbie. We're at time now, and so let me thank AMCHAM and Siobhan. I want to thank ShuiMei and Mario for joining us, and Debbie, thank you for a very thorough presentation. I think I'm sensing a lot of optimism here. It seems like there are real opportunities to be had for companies that want to utilize RCEP. And from what you're saying with the formation of these various committees, companies that are proactive on this have a real opportunity to help shape the rules. So I think that's terrific. Siobhan, you get the last word.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much to Mario, to ShuiMei, and also to Debbie, of course. And I hope to see all of us back again in 2021. Debbie, I think we're going to be seeing your face a lot and hearing from you, as there's so much to delve into in this agreement. There are many different chapters as we all start to get to know them a little bit better. But I think the important message here is that we actually have a lot of work to do. The AMCHAMs around the region are primed, as Debbie said, to be able to provide a really important insight and a platform in order for companies to work with and sort out some of the elements in these chapters. So I encourage everybody who's on the call to engage with our AMCHAMs. And allow us to be able to take some of those messages forward and work with the stakeholders that make sense. And as a secretariat gets formed, bring those messages to those committees. And I'm very delighted to be able to engage. I think this is a great time for the AMCHAMs of Asia Pacific, which brings together 28 different chambers in the region, to be able to bring together some of those thought leadership. So as I said, I hope to have all of us back again and working on some of the other areas that came up in the Q&A today, and delving a little bit deeper come 2021. So without any further ado, I just want to say happy holidays to everybody. I hope everybody can take a little bit of a break, including you, ShuiMei, even though it's ramping up for the shipments of vaccines around the world. Thank you very much to all the teams that are participating in all the efforts to make us safe. So with that, happy holidays to everybody.